Hello, and welcome to the Watch Reactions channel. If you do like this video, please consider liking and subscribing. It would be much appreciated. Now, this is the first of a three-part series on the rise of Casio, which tracks their evolution from the world of calculators into the Casiotron and beyond. I stop around 1980, which is the topic for part 2. So we understand something about the world that Casio plays into, a bit of history on mechanical calculators is needed first. So if we go way back, the first mechanical calculating machines, if we discount things such as the abacus, or William Schickard's calculating clock, and Blaise Pascal's Pascaline. On screen you can see some replicas of these original models. With those mandatory references out the way, where we get a bit more real on mechanical calculators is with the original arithmometer. This original invention was in the 1820s by Thomas de Colmar, but it had a really long route until it made a meaningful impact in the market for accountants, with versions produced at scale by Louis Payen, closer to the turn of the century. On screen is a really great YouTube video, the link I'll put in the description, which shows one of these early models at work. The comptometer also in the late 1800s advanced things as a key-driven mechanical calculator, originally developed by Dorr Felt, and manufactured at scale under Felt and Tarrant Manufacturing Company. With the comptograph you can see on screen, this added on a printing mechanism to this key-driven mechanical calculator. A competing modality around the same time was the Russian pinwheel calculator, the Oedner arithmometer, with the German Brunsviga variant of this becoming cloned by many, and this includes in Japan, with the major players being Tiger and Nippon calculating machines. Nippon would later become Busicom, which is a company that will re-emerge later as a significant player in microchips, working with the likes of Intel. So how does Casio play into this environment? Well, Tadao Casio originally founded Casio Seisakujo in 1946, after years working in a lathe factory, amongst other jobs. After working in these other areas, Tadao brought in his younger brother Tashio Casio, who was an aspiring inventor and imagined himself as a bit of an Edison. It was Tashio who developed their first big hit, which is a mandatory picture and reference on any Casio video, which was a ringy wart that enabled you to smoke cigarettes down to the nub. The epicenter of a lot of the business world in Tokyo was Ginza Street, which you can see a picture of on screen around the time the Casio brothers were attending a business fair. This was around 1949. There was some of the latest technology on display, which included an electric-driven mechanical calculator. An example of this type of technology is the Madas 20. On screen, the picture is from vintagecalculators.com, which is a fantastic website that you should visit. The story goes that this set a spark in the Casio brothers, who would bring their other brothers on board, Kazuo and Yukio, so it was now a truly family affair. After some wrong turns with a more solenoid electromagnet-driven approach, which the prototype was developed in 1954, Tashio put a stop to that avenue and pushed the team of brothers down the route of a fully electric relay-based calculator. The relay was a technology seen in the telephone exchange, with the simplest analogy being the relay race, where the message, or think baton, is passed on from one circuit to the next. This innovation drove the development of the Casio 14A, which was the world's first compact, supposedly, relay computing machine, which was launched in 1957, and it's this time when Casio, named as such based upon the obvious pronunciation of the brothers' last names, which is a bit easier to pronounce in other countries, and this started with them launching a big partnership with a large office supplier, Uchido Yoko. This is what really put them into the big time, and you can proudly see the 4 Casio brothers on screen next to a bunch of their 14As. The difference that you need to remember is between electric versus electronic devices, with electronic devices including electronic components, such as the transistor originally discovered in 1947 at Bell Labs by William Shockley, John Bardeen and Walter Bratton. The fun news on this one, as you can likely tell from my accent, is that it was the British who really drove this development. The Bell Punch Company, established in 1878, was in the very glamorous game of ticket punches, think train ticket punches, clocking in and out of work, and related devices. When looking to diversify, they got into the game of adding machines for accountants, with the first one branded in the name of Sumlock. They also acquired the rights to the comptometer, which we talked about before, and this would become a company named Sumlock Comptometer Limited. In 1956, Norman Kitts, originally Norbert Kitts, introduced the use of the cold cathode switching tubes, which are essentially early versions of the transistors because transistors weren't quite yet ready for prime time. They used Nixie tubes, which were tubes that provided the illuminated numbers, and the Decatron, which the Vintage Calculator website describes as being the vacuum tube era version of the integrated circuit. This resulted in the Anita, a new inspiration to arithmetic is what that stands for, Marks 7 and 8, which were the world's first electronic desktop calculators. The big mover in this market in Japan was not actually Casio, but was rather Sharp, one of their main competitors. In 1964, in close proximity to the US typewriter company Friden, the Italian company IME, and the excellently named US right line Maffetron, developed the first transistorized electronic desktop calculators. Playing catch-up, Casio moved from its relay calculators to the electronic world with the 001 in 1965. This had a cool memory function, which was kind of its USP. In a similar trend, Casio caught up with the frontrunners on integration of metal oxide semiconductors, or MOS, integrated circuits into their calculator. In this case, it was the US brand Victor that were at the leading edge, with their own model developed by Casio being the Casio 152. So now we've seen the brothers transition over from electronic relay calculators into the start of electronic calculators. Now we get into the proper fun, the cutthroat so-called calculator wars with other Japanese companies, European and US companies. This drove lots of innovation, as we'll see, but also drove a lot of folks out of business in the calculator area, at least. This is similar to what happened in the digital LCD watch market, which you can see more about in my other video on that specific topic. Initially, there was a lot of collaboration between the big Japanese companies in this market and the US electronic industry. Remember that it was Jack Kilby of Texas Instruments, alongside William Shockley at Fairchild Semiconductor, that originally developed the integrated circuit. Remember, I said Visicom would come back into the picture later, and here is where they do. It was Texas Instruments themselves that, through Jack Kilby's team, miniaturized electronic components via the integrated circuit board so much that we could start to think about handheld calculators. Now, Sharp, working with the US company Rockwell, who developed MOS circuit boards, drove a lot of the miniaturization from small-scale integration to medium-scale integration to large-scale integration, and it was this large-scale integration that was needed to fit electronics into a handheld device. The fruits of this progress was the Sharp QT8D Micro Compact. Close behind, Canon, working with Texas Instruments, developed the first battery-powered handheld calculator. The next stage in progressing things was the mission to create a calculator on a chip, rather than multiple integrated circuit boards. The winner of this battle in the calculator wars was Visicom, working with Moztec, and you can see a picture of this on screen. The factor enabling even more miniaturization and lower power usage was the move over to the complementary metal oxide semiconductor, or CMOS integrated circuit boards, which you'll hopefully remember from my other video on this topic was the circuit board provided from Intersil to Seiko that enabled the commercial release of the first quartz watch, the Seiko Astron. It was again Sharp that got there first in 1972, notably now not working with its original US partner, but with a domestic partner, Toshiba. It was companies like Toshiba, Hitachi and NEC that were really a growing force at this time in the Japanese microelectronics industry. So what was Casio's role as part of this overall calculator war? Well, their big move was the Casio Mini, launched in 1972, partnering with Hitachi. During this time, there was around 50 players in the market, and it really was the peak of the war. Their success was through marketing it as a personal calculator that anyone could use and not just accountants and such. This was supported primarily by the affordable price point. It was this product and its later versions that really put Casio in a leading position in the market and formed the basis of the grasp it has on the global market today. Outside the drive to miniaturization of the electronics was the technology behind the displays. Nixie tubes, which we've already mentioned, were a technology that was owned by the Burroughs Corporation. So to avoid paying royalties, Sharp developed a new version of this, known as vacuum fluorescent display tubes. Beyond this, similar to the world of watches with Hamilton and Electric Data being the pioneers of LED, using Hewlett-Packard LED technology, Busicom was the first to launch an LED calculator. Dynamic scattering liquid crystal displays, which is another topic that I covered quite a lot in my other video, The History of the Digital Watch, found their way into Lloyd's and rapid data models first, which weren't so popular, but the twisted pneumatic LCD displays, which I go into a lot of detail explaining in that other video, became the dominant mode of LCD display, and were first deployed in the Gruen Teletime in 1972. Seiko, Orient and Citizen were the first in that game, carrying over their heritage from the mechanical watch and quartz spheres, so Casio was a very new entrant. With the calculator wars at its peak, the importance of diversifying was clear to stabilise revenues, and with its work on electronic components, digital quartz watches was an obvious move. As a newcomer, its way in was partnering with lots of other companies to supply the materials it needed to develop a watch. Casio commissioned Japanese company Oki in 1972 to start work on a CMOS integrated circuit that could be used in its initial watch. There's an interesting first-hand story about this, and I'll put the link in the description, about Casio linking up with the Swiss LCD manufacturer Videlec, which is part of the Brown Boveri & C group that worked with Roche on the original twisted pneumatic LCD displays. Toyacom, later Epson Toyacom, was the Japanese company of choice to supply the quartz oscillator, and Union Carbide would provide the silver oxide battery. This was all packaged together by Casio in their first caliber, the QW02. Note that the QW01 was actually launched later, which is quite typical of Casio numbering systems, and all this resulted in the Casiotron in 1974. Its unique feature was the ability to automatically determine the number of calendar days in a month. The Casiotron line would later go on for a long time under the QW or Quartz Watch reference, and in a sign that it was getting ahead of its competitors, Casio was able to learn from its experience with the Casiotron in bringing the first handheld twisted pneumatic display calculator with the Casio Pocket LC1 and LC2. With part of the narrative now clear on how Casio came to dominate the calculator market, we can now start to see how it keeps up in the digital watch space, with the race in that area to add more and more features and leverage more and more new technologies. This section is a bit out of chronology, and I just did that so that some of the stories behind the different functions can come out a bit more clearly. The first function we'll consider is the alarm. Prized for the first mover in the wristwatch alarm, well, the electronic one at least, as is often the case, was a Swiss company, and this was the NetPro Zansara, which this YouTube video gives us a snippet of. Other NetPro models can be seen in Peter Duenson's excellent book, Watch, History of the Modern Wristwatch, which I did use to help structure a lot of this section of the video. Now, it was Citizen that was the first to get an alarm function into an LCD watch, and as was often the case, Seiko was also one of the first movers. I've not actually been able to pin down the exact first Casio model that introduced the alarm feature. If you know, put it in the comments. But an example of an early one from digitalwatch.com, which is an amazing website that you should visit, is up on screen. However, foreshadowing some of its later moves into the musical sphere, they were closer in getting there earlier, narrowly beaten by Orient, with Module 82 and their variety of melody alarm watches. You can hear an example I found in someone else's YouTube video on screen now. No surprise that they subsequently launched the Casiotron keyboard in the same year of 1980, which marked their move into this space, for which they're still known today, in addition to calculators and watches. Funnily enough, in the spirit of merging their different businesses into products, they had made an earlier calculator with the ability to play melodies, and Simon Magpie on YouTube does a fun video making music on these original devices. Next, Casio goes full circle and integrates the calculator into its watch business. Again, they weren't even close to being the first on this, with the Hamilton Pulsar LED calculator watch being first, followed by Citizen and Seiko in the world of LCD calculator watches in 1977. In the same year, National Semiconductor developed a full-blown scientific calculator on a watch that they launched at the Basel Fair, which they then went on to sell to multiple different manufacturers. If we stay within the Casio microcosm though, we can see that they were on their own relentless journey towards their own calculator watch. In 1976, they integrated a clock into their electronic calculator, with the transition over to an LCD version of this combination with the MQ1 and MQ2. The Mini Card and Micro Mini show how Casio was getting in smaller and smaller with their calculators, with the C80 in 1980 marking its move into the calculator watch space, which would go on to dominate in the 80s. This was a similar move to the Calculator Mini we discussed before, where the play was to make it affordable to everyone to own, rather than being a specialist high-end piece like the other manufacturers had done. Talking of a play on affordability, it's noticeable that most of the digital watches in the 70s were metal, with the 80s being the era of the plastic watch that were later cheaply produced through Hong Kong. At a high level, the use of synthetic materials began as early as 1966 with, again, the Swiss company, Vumard Time Company, the French company Lip, which would also use this within the Calypso in 1968, and much more extensive use of synthetic material by Tissot in the Astralon series in 1970 and 1971. Casio's first foray into plastic, I think, was the very cool F100 released in 1977. The reason it becomes even cooler is that a modified version of this was used by Ripley in the Alien film, which adds it next to Giugiaro, Ripley and Bishop's in the list of super cool watches for me. You would start to see many more plastic watches from Casio after this point, with some examples, I believe, from 1979 on this old poster. Well, how about the chronograph, or as the less particular may call it, the stopwatch? Well, first on this was Seiko. I've not actually been able to identify for sure, but some of the early Casiotrons already had this feature, originally listed as stopwatch. It would later go on to both metal and plastic watches as a chronograph clock complication, partnered up with the alarm function as being one of the main headlines that they would put on the watch face. Finally, and very briefly, world time. So the first Casio watch to have the world time function was the Casiotron X1 R17 in 1976, but the thing that I think looks cooler, which was actually in the same year, is the 29 QS11, which had 10 different time zones and I think just has a nicer look. Now, these more basic features in the 1970s were fun, but Casio would really start to come into its own in the true madness of the 80s, and it's this era of Casio that will be the topic of part 2 of this video series. If I've missed any big chunks from this earlier era, or if there's anything you'd really like to see in the next part, please do put your thoughts down in the comments. It's highly likely I've missed things, and I've been very reliant on a few sources for this. A lot of the information that I used was from the excellent vintage calculator website, digitalwatch.com, Casio's own website, and the really excellent books Electrifying the Wrist Watch and A Watch, History of the Modern Wristwatch. So that's the end of today's video on the Watch Reactions channel. If you've enjoyed it, please do like and subscribe, and you can see more topics on similar areas, such as my video on electric watches, digital watch rabbit holes, and the broader history of digital watches on my channel. I don't get much favours done for me through the algorithm, so if you share my video, that would also be super appreciated. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.